And it's great to have the great man here, as one of our members just said. It's great to have Kim Beazley here as well. More of Kim in a minute. But I'd particularly like to welcome our life members, our donors, our committee members, our members and our guests, particularly our guests. And I'll put in the plug now, if you're not a member of the Institute of International Affairs and you're interested in international affairs, you're not a member, you're camping out. You need to be a member. So please book online and please join online, and there are plenty of people who will help you join tonight. But a special welcome to everyone. The format for tonight is quite straightforward. Kim will speak, there's room for Q&A, and at about 7:45 we'll move outside, and there's festive fare for everyone because it's our Christmas party. And I might just really start now by introducing Kim, a man who needs little introduction, but I think I would like to introduce you, Kim. Kim was born in Perth, went to Hollywood High School, went to the University of Western Australia as a Rhodes Scholar, then went to Oxford. He was always involved in politics, and the family, as everyone here would know, had a long political tradition with a father who was very active in the Labor Party and in government and held a number of ministries. And in 1980, Kim became a parliamentarian and enjoyed a number of ministries as well. He was the Minister for Finance, the Minister for Transport and Communications. He was the Minister for Defence and had a major role in developing a submarine capacity here in Australia. He was the Minister for Employment, Education and Training, and he kept on the Security Committee of Cabinet for a long time in a number of those ministries as well, as I recall. But not many people, we don't get to introduce many people who are also Deputy Prime Minister, and so it's a great honour to have a Deputy Prime Minister here tonight. He was also leader of the ALP, leader of the opposition, Chancellor of the University of Western Australia, and most recently, Ambassador to the United States of America from 2010 to 2016. He also has an Order of Australia, and he's also our National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. So, with that brief introduction, I'd like to hand over to Kim to talk about a broad subject, Trump. Reflections of our time. Thanks, Kim.
I'm just thinking on the lapel, is this working? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I can't tell whether it's projecting or not once you're behind it. Thank you very much for that introduction, John. Not UWA was our Chancellor.
Sorry,
AIIA.
Yeah.
UWA would have been paid. But it's not merited. AIIA, you do it for the love of it. But look, before I get into talking about the new American president, just to thank all of you for being members of the Institute. This is your Christmas party. You've had a terrific year. The whole Institute's had a good year. For reasons that, well, I can fathom now, but couldn't when I took over this job. You are members of the leading think tank in East Asia. And part of it's down to the meetings that you have very regularly and the quality of the people that you have speaking to you. A lot of it's down to the intellectual pursuits of the Institute that we effectively preside over, an umbrella organisation for. The leading journal that we publish is the leading academic journal in foreign policy for the region. And of course we have our website, Australian Outlook, and we are very actively engaged in not just simply the foreign policy debate, but foreign policy understanding in the Australian community. I've loved speaking around the Institute at different branches, as I have been over the last few months, and noticing something so different from when I used to be a member of the Institute years ago. It was a gathering place for the expert elderly, like myself. Elderly anyway, experts for other people to judge. But it has in recent years had an enormous influx of young folk
Yes.
who really have livened the place up. Also, I'm glad to say that when they put it on their CVs, when they apply for employment all around the country, it's an enormous advantage to have been there. It's also a reflection of the fact that international relations has basically taken over the politics departments of the country, to the extent where in some places, like Flinders, the two have been separated out. But when I did a double major in Indian history and international relations at UWA, when I was an undergraduate, and the international relations component of the politics department, the students who were in it, consisted of me. The rest of the politics department did political theory or institutions, and the sorts of subjects which make up the agenda of the average politics department of the day. Now that's turned around. It's in the opposite direction. 75% of politics students in Australia study international relations, and the institution's theory is sort of a closing group. And so I think the young people who are coming in with a lot of passion about international relations, and it reflects, they reflect the fact that we are, well, I would argue, leave aside the EU and what it constitutes, where people are automatically interested in what's going on in the neighbourhood. Take that away and just count the EU as an entity. We are, without doubt, the most effectively focused country in the world on international politics. We think of ourselves as insular. We are not. We're not insular in the composition of our population, and we're not insular in our world outlook. We may be wrong from time to time, but we're not insular. And we have an understanding in this country that we have our friends, we have our diplomacy in the neighbourhood, we do the best we can, but we are alone. We will survive largely as the years go by on our wits and our skill, our courage from time to time. I was always conscious of the fact that when I was defenceman, survival for Australia would always be a close run thing. And we really have to think through our international security, and it goes to weapons and weapons capabilities, but that's the final resort. In the first instance, it goes to being able to live effectively in the region around us. Life is tough for Australian strategists. And if our allies or friends go somewhat feral, then we need to be focused on that and to try and do something about it. And I think we're going to be tested over the next few years, the next 4 years, in terms of the conversations that we have with what, for the last, since World War II, has been our traditional ally. And this can be a challenge for Australian ministers, and there's going to be a lot of potential dispute in the way in which problems are being handled. I am, for example, a little concerned that Mike Beazley is off to talk to the Trump people about the issues of sending some of the folk on Nauru to the US. On the whole, I would have preferred to see Joe Hockey doing that and not worrying much about it, because I would not want to have our first appearance in the front of Trump as a needy people. Our first appearance in front of Trump, I would have hoped, would have been of a very hard-nosed, effective group with a lot of opinions on the directions he would want to take the United States. So that's a bit disappointing. Understandable, because the government would be worried that particular proposition, important to us, fallen apart. The immigration issue is an interesting one. We think as West Australians that our prosperity is driven by the minerals and the energy and agricultural product that we in the Queenslanders produce, and it's undoubtedly extremely important. But our prosperity in this country is driven by immigration. It's counterintuitive. The worse you're off economically, the more people you should import. And that sounds totally counterintuitive, that would be the position. And the temptation always is for governments that if you're in a period of unemployment or slowdown, which we are in at the moment, and we're in that big time here in Western Australia, that perhaps we ought to cut back on the numbers of folk that we're getting into the country. We do that, we will simply reinforce a downward spiral. And we tend to forget that our people are not employed in mining industries. They're not employed on the land. They're a bit employed in manufacturing. They're massively employed in services. We have to keep faith in this country with our heavy immigration program, because if we do not, there will be no jobs for our kids. And so defending that program is vitally important to us. We import 1% of our population every year. And as a result of that, we now are up to 26% of our population being born outside Australia. US, which we think of as a high immigration country, it's about 11. And if you take that percentage of our population that is first generation plus the 26%, you're close to 50%. So that is driving, it's driving the huge expansion of our cities. It's what's driving our kids nuts when they try to find a home that they can actually afford. But it is what sustains us. And that sustainment, the way we do that, and the way we're open to it, is enormously reflective of the way in which we see the world and understand the world. And we are very good at it. As a people, we are very good at it. Better than anyone else I know, any other country I've ever studied. We are very, very competent. And of course, it means that our population is changing. The second largest language spoken in Australian homes after English is Chinese, or Mandarin. And the biggest new language developing in Australia is Hindi. And none of our universities, oh, that's not quite true, but hardly any of our universities teach it. And when they teach it, they tend to teach it as Urdu and not as Hindi per se. But that's in the part of the big mix that we are. We are a nation gradually and for our survival, importantly, appearing to begin to blend with the region that is around us. Now, some of our people are struggling with that. If their struggles manifest themselves ultimately as government decisions, we are completely euchred. So other countries can afford Brexit-type ideologies and elections of Donald Trump. We cannot afford a successful one nation. One nation, written into policy, the policy positions they prescribe is death for Australia. It's not just an inconvenience. And I don't think the political parties are taking that seriously now as we used to when I was engaged in politics. That is a vastly long introduction which has taken 10 minutes out of Trump, but that's all right, because I wanted to do that so that we could get a bit of a, when I start talking about it and start talking about the Americans, we need to be quite understanding, develop a deep understanding in our situation. Because a lot of the debates that we have, frankly, are debates that are one-dimensional. Oh, if you don't like the Americans, we'll go with Asia. These aren't choices. We have the good fortune to be in the only alliance system of which Mr. Trump unreservedly approves. And we are now deeply embedded in the US economy via investment, and they and us via investment, and we're deeply embedded in the American intelligence system and in the American military. And that produces for us the type of equipment that does at least give us, if we had to go down to the ultimate in self-preservation, it does actually give us the capacity to do it. So now, Mr. Trump, the minority president. The vagaries of the American electoral system have been on display for us big time, in a way I never thought was really likely or possible. Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes. That is, Obama won by 4.5. That is extraordinary. Now, in the system, you would expect the odd result like that which came with George W. Bush. He was behind Al Gore by 500,000 and behind him in the Electoral College by 2. That's understandable. You can fancy a system working out somewhat like that. But he's behind by 3 million votes and ahead by about 80 in the Electoral College. That's quite extraordinary. That shows the weakness, essentially, of the system that would produce that. Hillary Clinton would have been a comfortable winner in a presidential election in any other country that has presidents. But she lost this one. And that is a matter of no small moment. It's producing a set of volatility in American policy like we have not seen before. Obama was a good president for this region. The United States since World War II has run carried the flag for what you might describe as liberal internationalism. The system that they invented after World War II was essentially marked by a rules-based order for the global commons, a rules-based order for relationships between states, a general tendency towards global free trade, underpinned in the first instance by an extended deterrent system which meant that people could have confidence in their freedom if they were threatened without resorting to supplying themselves with nuclear weapons and instituting a very great instability at the core of the international system. These things were essential for a reasonable chance of the protection of the average country's sovereignty, and you didn't have to actually agree with American policy at any point in time in all of that to be anything other than appreciative of what they provided. No one more appreciative, by the way, than the Chinese, because it was the American system that they got ready, by which they got ready, peaceful, and lucrative access to the global economy that has, to this point in time, driven Chinese growth. So this is overall beneficial. Obama's contribution to the ongoing story of American liberal internationalism was to bring a number of issues to the table that had not been there under previous administrations or had not been pursued actively under previous administrations. He brought climate change issues to the table. Odd, wasn't it, when Trump talked with Xi, and Xi was telling him, you better start taking this climate change stuff seriously, Mr. President-elect, because we have an ongoing dialogue here which is pretty important. He introduced that to the table, brought that to the table. He brought nuclear disarmament to the table in a modern context. Previously, the big debate in on nuclear disarmament globally was the balancing of the situation between the Soviet Union and the United States, then Russia and the United States. Now the issue is proliferation, and it's an issue majorly. Obama tried to do something about that, and on neither front was he successful, but he was successful in putting it sensibly on the global agenda. And then he took to the Asian region, Asian politics, an acceptance of a version of liberal internationalisms in relations between the states of the region. So he decided to pivot to Asia, but he pivoted with a complex agenda, not just a security agenda. He pivoted with an economic agenda, with a human rights agenda. He had a whole range of issues that he wanted to insert himself as a favourable player in the international organisations of the region. Most notably, he took up the East Asian Summit. More important than the multilateral component was a bilateral component. Started under George W. Bush, but perfected under Obama. The most important meeting that takes place in this region, and I would argue globally, is a thing called the Security and Economic Dialogue, which is an annual conversation between China and the United States. And Obama would never permit that to be held hostage to what others would argue as China's misbehaviour. So, be it in the East China Seas or South China Seas, or behaviours on cyber issues, climate change, whatever. He would not render that conversation subject to a particular Chinese behaviour elsewhere. He chose to have at those meetings a conversation about any grievances that the two sides had with each other. Through that process, he treated China as what it was, which was what it is, which is a power moving towards, not there yet, or probably for some time, the co-equal status. He treated China with substantial dignity, whilst at the same time being disappointed in their performance on a variety of fronts. And that was what he did was essentially of a piece of the thrust of American policy to this point. It's never been wholly, as nothing ever is in any society, wholly accepted policy. There are critics of this in the United States and various elements of its manifestation. And the most notable criticism from the right has been the idea that the United States should not find itself bound in by the global rules. The United States should find itself only in a situation where it pursues its interests. And the categorisation of this policy, this approach, has always been, Reagan argued it for a moment, George W. Bush argued it, peace through strength. And the assumption of that is, if the United States maintains massive military power, then the United States can rely on that alone to extend its will in relations with other countries. The view being that if you threaten an American friend or if you misbehave in the global situation, the Americans will not sort of talk to you about it, or they'll smack your head off. And a lot of people in the analyses of the United States at the moment are saying things like, well, the US is abandoning world leadership. Yes, it is abandoning the focus it has had on the liberal international project. But if Trump has his way, both on the military and economic front, the United States over 4 to 8 years was emerged as immensely more powerful, militarily and economically, and pretty powerful now on both those fronts. So simply by taking a step aside, it's not going isolationist. Everybody talks about the US going isolationist. No, it's going unilateralist. That is a different order issue altogether. So you can see that harbinger of things to come in what's going on at the moment over Taiwan. The direction of Trump's policy lacks wisdom. It's going to be a really difficult situation emerging if this persists. Trump's a deal maker, he's very proud of that. But he assumes that a deal in international politics is like a deal in business. Essentially, a deal in business is ahistorical. It deals with a due diligence on each other's capacities and the project to hand. There is history behind where you get to that point of due diligence, but it's what is immediately there, what immediately meets the eye, that is the subject of discourse between businessmen on some deal that they may want to do. That's not international politics. International politics is totally freighted with history, totally freighted. So he has this view at the moment. He expressed it the day before yesterday in an interview about how to handle relations with China, and he said, I'm putting on the table the One China policy. Now, the problem is, if you put on the table the One China policy, you don't actually have a table. Because the Chinese no longer will talk to you. They're not going to do a deal on the One China policy in the context of a trade agreement. If the folk in the world at the moment with most to be concerned about are the Taiwanese. Just contemplate this. They know that China is constantly making choices about their fate. There's a debate in China. The majority position is that they accept the idea that at some point in time in an ill-defined future, that the province, the road province of Taiwan will be part of China in a formal constitutional sort of way. And sometimes they think quite creatively about that. That is the position that has been adopted by the United States and them since 1979. On the one hand, be part of China in a formal constitutional sort of way. And sometimes they think quite creatively about that. That is the position that has been adopted by the United States and them since 1979. On the one hand, the United States recognises and behaves accordingly that Taiwan is part of China. On the other hand, the Chinese agree that they do not contemplate a mechanism for dealing with that by anything other than a consensual arrangement to conclude it. That was the 79 deal. We all tend to forget about that second element of it. We remember the first, but not the second. And Trump is obsessed with the first and not the second, or the underpinnings, the historical underpinnings of the second. If you're sitting in Taiwan, what has Trump just said to you? He has said this: I am going to stamp on that agreement, and I'm going to effectively render it void, and then I'm going to trade it again for an agreement on a variety of other areas of disagreement. Well, hell. So, my security is not saying to me, right, he's going to recognise us as a separate entity and a separate nation. He's going to surround us with a hedgehog-like defence, a very active American military engagement, and that's our future, and we can have within that framework a sort of separate national prospect. No, he's not saying that. What he's saying is that I'm a bargaining chip. That might be an outcome, but probably it won't be. Probably a deal will be struck. So where are you left? Previously, you had things batting along relatively quietly. Now you have created an impression in the minds of those in China, who are many, particularly within the PLA, that your future as part of China is no longer achievable by peaceful means. That is now a fiction that cannot be sustained, as opposed to what you thought was simply a fiction anyway. That's a hell of a position to be in. So the deal is done, the One China policy survives, and those in the PLA who argue that you should deal with this issue by military means have that much better argument, a massively better argument than they've had before, that you should pursue the process that way. It's terrible. And the so-called friends of Taiwan have put them in that position by getting hold of Trump's mind and suggesting that's a sensible way to go. So, I was in a meeting. We've just launched a book on Australia's American Alliance, which is, I think, even though I've got a chapter in it, it has to have a downside. But the rest of the book is probably, I think, the best thing that we've written in recent times, in comprehending all the issues for Australia with the relationship with the United States. And we're having a set in the Woolnough Lecture Theatre here. We're having a bit of a launch. And, the question was asked of the three of us on the stage, two editors and myself, what we thought the first crisis would be. The other two blokes said, it'll be Korea, it'll definitely be Korea, that'll be the first crisis. My response was, the first crisis has now commenced.
Is what?
now commenced. We are now in the early stages of the first crisis. So a lot will depend on whom he ultimately appoints as the Secretary of State. His Defence Secretary is somebody who will give him good advice on this, General Mattis. General Mattis is definitely not trawling for a bruising on this particular issue. But his Secretary of State, and particularly a Deputy Secretary, one of the two Deputy Secretaries who has general carriage of day-to-day policy, it could either be folk who bring this to an end in a way that Trump trusts, or folk who augment it massively. So if it is a selection like Romney, or like the chap who's Corker as chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, or either of those would probably be quite balanced and helpful about these sorts of issues.
Yep. He uses his pitch, Tillerson, the ExxonMobil guy.
Well, on this particular matter, the probably doesn't count for much. He certainly will have a struggle to get himself confirmed in the Foreign Affairs Committee, but because the Republicans are a bit down on people who are friendly with Russia. But on this issue, not much. If he gets John Bolton as the Deputy Secretary of State, you've got a world of hurt on your hands, and that'll be problematic. Tillerson, I would say, leave all the Russian stuff aside. One thing you cannot say about somebody who heads up an oil giant is that they're ignorant of international politics. This guy has been doing, all his life, he's been doing global risk analysis. And he would know the intimacies of the politics of every region where ExxonMobil operates, and that's pretty well everywhere. So Tillerson, from that point of view, just alone, is not a candidate you particularly worry about, but he would also, on China, I think, be quite sensible. But what his deputy does would be what would be critical. So that's that's the setting. That's the change. That's going to be the big challenge for Australia. How we manoeuvre our way through what this particular situation is producing. But it's much more than that, because it means too that the ways in which the countries of the region relate to the United States are going to shift, not just in accordance with his judgment of the core relationship, but his own approach to issues like trade, like human rights, like the concerns that the United States has had with them, like climate change, which the Americans managed to activate them on, but now the United States is about to walk back from it quite substantially. And so one would expect in the East Asian Sun, one would expect if the S&ED system continued in China at all, that there's going to be quite a problematic situation for the countries of the region used to dealing with the United States empathetically. I've already noticed from friends of mine who are talking around the region, the questions to Australia are already starting. And the initial questions are, what's going on with the United States? You're supposed to know a fair bit about them. And the questions will, soon they'll move beyond questions to views that they expect us to put. I had a small example of that when we were negotiating the Asian Investment Bank, where we diverged massively from the Americans on the course of action we ought to pursue. The Americans were dead opposed to it. They thought the bank was undermining the Asian Development Bank, undermining the IMF, undermining the principles that have been put forward for decent governance of banks. And the US was not happy that we proceeded through a discussion with China on it. And we agreed to disagree. We said, no, we don't see things that way. We see that China's emerging is going to want to put its imprint on some sort of international economic institution, and you should be in a situation where you're supporting of that sort of direction. So as the ambassador, I was in the middle of this, because I'm delivering most of the messages and receiving them the most. But the interesting thing was that the argument that we had in the end, they accepted. We kept them fully informed of what we were doing about governance in relation to the bank, and they were very happy with the directions that we were taking it. The point that I made to them was this: this is the big difference between you and us on China and East Asian matters. You look at China from an East-West perspective through the Confucian societies. You have much more expertise than we have on Confucian societies, including on China. We look at China with a North-South perspective. We look through the states of South and Southeast Asia. We look through the Islamic, Hindu and Buddhist societies into the relationship with China. And one thing that all of them are saying to us right now is, you must be in that bank. You must do it. Because you alone have the capacity to have a conversation with China about governance, which we cannot have. Because we are going to be supplicants to this. We're not going to be the proprietors, effectively, of this bank. And so that's typical of the region, not just on that matter. The region expects us to have an authoritative dialogue with the United States and be a deliverer of messages both ways. So that was a small thing. Now it's going to be quite a large thing, I think, over the next year or two. I've talked in a very limited way about the international issues that we confront, but by far and a long way, this is our most important. We've got important things that we're doing in the Middle East. We've got important issues coming up in the European sphere. We've got important concerns about contemporary Russian policy. But nothing matters more to us than the character of American and Chinese policy in our region. And of all the initiatives that have been foreshadowed so far, this has, if you like, the most flesh on the bones, and the body which is emerging from the skeleton is not one that we're going to find very comfortable to deal with. So I'll leave it at that and happily take questions.
Thanks, Ken. Well, I wonder, on that note, if I could have some questions. And I know there'll be plenty, so I'll go over here. And just as a courtesy, obviously introduce and ask Kim.
Hello, Kim, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Crystal Hartig from Young Australians in International Affairs. My question is related to recent developments between Japan and Russia. So Japan, Prime Minister Abe and Putin look to be meeting very shortly to discuss the return of islands in Okinawa. There has actually been recent discussion that should Russia accept the need to return a few of these islands to Okinawa, that this could have a direct impact on the US and Japan alliance. Could I just get your perspective on this issue?
I think there's obviously the US would be interested in what sort of outcome was reached, but I think it really is bilateral. And I'm no legal monkey, so I can't really pronounce on the legalities here. But apparently there is a difference between the northern two islands and the southern two islands in their legal status. That Russia can exercise a fairly legitimate claim on the top two and Japan on the bottom two, but all of them were caught up in the awards to Russia after World War II, and it's extraordinarily sensitive amongst Japanese nationalists, and it's extraordinarily sensitive amongst Russian nationalists. And neither side would find, perhaps the Russians might, but the Japanese right certainly wouldn't find a solution that split the difference being an acceptable solution. So given that Abe, who's very innovative in his its foreign policies, is nevertheless the sort of putative leader of the Japanese right, he would feel himself pretty heavily curtailed in coming out with an agreement that that awarded them one way or another, awarded anything less than the 4. And Putin probably wouldn't have wanted to, for his nationalist constituency, wouldn't want to award any. However, there's a lot to be gained by both sides here. Putin has become a Chinese satrap, undignified, grovelling presence for the Chinese, and you know, he's sitting there at the moment, humiliated by the inability to get any traction on producing that energy deal that he's done with them. The Chinese are eating his lunch in Central Asia. They're basically driving the Russians out economically. And there's actually nothing that the Russians can do about it. Remember this about Russia. Their GDP is the same size as ours. And look at what they're trying to do with Australia's economy in what they're attempting now in relation to China and everyone else. They're really on a knife edge. So the Japanese relationship, and Abe has become a sort of deft Putin whisperer, is the Chinese, that relationship is just a bit of a chance for Putin to devise something that makes the Chinese mildly uncomfortable and still appear legitimate. So he's got something there. And from Abe's point of view, he wants, as he emerged with a distinctive Japanese foreign policy emerging, he wants to balance his relationships with others, particularly with the United States, by an effective relationship with Russia. I don't think they're going to come to conclusions. They may come to a sort of something that Yeltsin suggested a few years ago, which was some sort of mutual co-development economically of the zone. When you say, well, what would the US want from that, or whatever, what would the Russians want from it? The US wouldn't want much at all. The US is not looking for extra bases in Japan. So one would assume that any agreement would, at least from the Japanese side, demilitarise it. But it's not easy for the Russians to contemplate that. Those islands and the military bases they have on the northern islands are part of the sort of submarine sanctuary that operates out of Vladivostok. So that whole area is absolutely chock-a-block with underwater sensors and the like, trying to protect Russian ballistic missile submarines who were a nuclear war to break out with the US, they'd chug out into that submarine sanctuary zone and fire their missiles at the United States from there. So they don't want, they'd be very worried if the US got a position there. But it's very difficult to think that would be an outcome from any discussion. Unfortunately, that's become more important to the Russians. It wasn't so important 10 years ago, but it's become more important to them now. I don't think there'll be a solution at this meeting, but there'll be lots of good friendly remarks.
And this question over here.
Thanks for your talk, Kim. David Tier, political animal. Just wondering, since there is already talk of impeachment of Donald Trump, who you would prefer, I'm just asking for a blunt opinion, perhaps under Chatham House rules, I'm not sure, who you would prefer and why between Donald Trump and Mike Pence?
Well, I wouldn't have a say in that impeachment, but it's quite interesting. Trump is, you learn something new about American politics every day. I thought I knew everything about it when I came home, and I realised after this election there are vast gaps in my knowledge. And one of them is this: if you live in the United States for any period of time, you become conscious of the harshness of their laws on conflict of interest related to public office holders. I mean, there's always a trial going on with some poor bloody governor somewhere, or legislator, or state official, or federal official, for having breached some of these very tough laws. They apply to all public office holders except one. That's the President of the United States. Under American law, the President of the United States determines what's a conflict of interest. There's another area of liberal interpretation of what of the legal system within the political context, and that is Congress's position. You can impeach a president for high crimes or misdemeanours. What is a high crime or misdemeanour? A high crime or misdemeanour is what the Congress says it is. So you've got conflict of interest for the president is what he says it is. High crime and misdemeanour is what Congress says it is. And the various Trump's operation already is way beyond any performance of mixture of business and interests and political position in any situation for a president-elect to this point. At this point in time, a president-elect will be absolutely uncoupling everything he does into blind trust, selling all sorts of stuff, all of that sort of thing. Whereas Trump, while he's having his telephone conversation with the president of Taiwan, has his operators in Taiwan seeking planning approval for a couple of buildings that he wants to put in place there. Now, normally in conflict of interest, law in the United States, appearance is almost as important as fact, and so that's an interesting thing. One thing you do know is this, that a large number of the Republicans in Congress do not like Donald Trump. They were very hostile to his appointment. They've been hostile to his election. On the other hand, particularly those who are most hostile love Mike Pence. And Trump may be a candidate at the next election. Age-wise, it would not seem likely, let alone anything that might go wrong in the government. But Pence definitely would be a candidate. And what better way to sustain a Republican presidency than to have Pence as the incumbent confronting that election? And what is the way that he gets to be an incumbent? And that is political action to get rid of Donald Trump. And now Mitch McConnell is an interesting kettle of fish. I describe him approvingly as a snake. And he is a really hard-nosed political operative. And I liked it the other day when a question was asked of him. You've seen Mr. Trump's views on additional infrastructure spending, additional spending on defence, big tax cuts. Are you going to be able to support that in Congress? And McConnell gave a suitably vague answer along the lines, certainly will be interesting discussions about all of that, sympathetic discussions, but interesting ones. And the questioner said to McConnell, but he's got a mandate. And McConnell's response was, you'll find that there's quite a lot of people being elected around here. And of course, it's not doable. The Trump agenda is not doable. If you did the totality of it, it would add $3 trillion over the next decade to the US budget deficit. And it would move from being 74% of GDP to about 120%. The Tea Party, I don't think, is going to permit this. And therefore, you can expect some really quite substantial fights over it all. You can also see their level of discomfort with things. Now, he tells us that Tillerson's just got that appointment, which was rumoured a couple of days ago. Well, so far, McCain, Rubio and Graham have said they won't sustain it. Combine that with the Democrats, you need one more Republican, he won't be confirmed. And so that's perhaps going to be the first big confrontation. On the whole, at the end of the day, they'll probably give him what he wants. And Tillerson, apart from being a person whom Trump would consider well qualified to be Secretary of State, and looking objectively at his record per se, not at the individual things he's done, or the positions he's held, it's probably okay. But he is, if you think Abe is a Putin whisperer, try this one. He's a decorated Putin whisperer. And the Republicans are already deeply troubled by the CIA reports on Russian interference in American elections, and they don't think of Trump as having won it for the Republican Party. There is no sense that Trump is part of the Republican structure. So the position that Trump basically take the racial issues aside, and that's a very big take aside, but take them aside, Trump's the most left-wing candidate the Americans have ever elected. And none of the positions that he adopts, aside from those racial positions, are positions that are supported by the Republican Party. So it's been set up for a bit of a fight, and part of the fight may ultimately include what you've talked about. I wouldn't give it, well, I would give it. If Pence emerges as the Republican president, they'll have a normal Republican president of a right-wing variety. But he stands, within the sort of framework of the Republican spectrum, which Trump doesn't.
But just you personally?
I would certainly rather have Pence, but but if I was a Democrat, probably not. If I was a Democrat, I'd probably want Trump to stay till the bitter end. He would probably be a far more vulnerable candidate next election than Pence would be.
Well, I'm just looking for the next hand up. I wonder if I could ask a question, Kim, and that goes to, you've already outlined a little bit about President Obama's legacy, particularly in this part of the world. Really interested in what he's like as a person and as well, given you were very close to him. And also how Hillary will be taking defeat. And the third part is just some comments, if you wouldn't mind, on the new Secretary for Defence, who's going to be a very important part of the cabinet.
Well, I'm not that close to Obama, let me tell you. I've met him a number of times, but he is not actually very close to anyone apart from his family. Oh, there are other friends that he has, but he's a cool guy and a sort of disconnected guy, totally charming, and very ordered in the way in which he expresses himself. Very conscious that there's an image of a ranting black man in the psyche of white racists, and he does not want to, in any shape or form, give any indication that he is a caricature. And he has been a wonderful balm for suffering people, particularly after acts of gun violence. And he ends up being as popular as any retiring president has been in recent times. Part of that is a feeling in the country, you don't know what you got till it's gone, but part of it is also just genuine respect for the man. You've got to understand this, that nobody really voted in the last election. I mean, the United States is one of 172 countries which hold elections, and it stands at number 138 on voter turnout. And this vote is about 5% down on Obama's vote. Unfortunately, most of those votes came off Hillary. But nobody's really voted in this election. Kids decided not to turn out at all, pretty much, which is another factor in Hillary losing. Kids, though, who did turn out, provided this situation. If only they had been allowed to vote and not their parents and grandparents, Trump would have won only 4 states. So it's like Brexit, where the kids supported remaining 3-1, but their feckless, worthless grandparents basically acted to destroy their future. And so that's Obama is. I mean, he had many wonderful moments with Obama, I have to say, in his visit here to Australia and meetings with prime ministers. But the prime minister actually, he loved Kevin Rudd, and Rudd gave him a lot of ideas about how he should operate in Asia. And he was happy to see Gillard, but paradoxically, the one who really impressed him was Tony Abbott. And I mean, it was a really interesting meeting. because I was worried sick about the visit, because Abbott agrees with Obama on nothing. And you've got an agenda, and you know that the disagreements are going to be formidable in it. And I was trying to work out all these weasel words and give them to the Prime Minister that he might be able to use in the discussion. And Abbott looked, oh, don't worry about it, Kim, it'll be all right. Oh, that's not the attitude. I want you to be as worried as I am. But, and you could tell too when you went into the room that, that something was on. Because generally speaking, you'd have the President, you'd have the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and then a few line officers. But you had lined up for Abbott, you had the President, you had the Vice President, Sec Defence, Sec State, an elegant and warm, across-the-board survey of what we could expect to talk over in the next hour. And it was good, but you could see the little flags coming up. You thought, oh God, there's a problem. And then he finished, and he said, well, Tony, is there anything that you'd like to say to us before we get down to discussing detail? And Abbott said, look, he said, I don't actually have a list of anything to ask of you. There's nothing I want to ask you for, nor do I have any complaints that I want to make to you. And I understand people who see you usually have lists of one or the other. I just want to tell you this, that I think that you're about to get into a lot of trouble in the Middle East. And I want to tell you that when you do, we will be with you in numbers. It was so, the Americans just absolutely rocked back. And for the next couple of months, you know, you keep getting reports back from the White House saying, we need more Tony Abbotts. That was Obama. What was the other one?
Hillary and the
Hillary. What will she be doing now?
How is she taking it?
Well, she'll be sad. She'll be sad beyond belief. She'll feel extraordinary guilt. They're now looking closer and closer at their campaign, and they see that there were certain essential things they could have done to win. When basically she just spurned the white working class. So if you spurn the white working class, you don't win. It's all very well to say the trends in American ethnicity, you know, are going in the direction of Hispanics and African Americans and Asians and so on. Yeah, well, they are, but we ain't got there yet. And 70% of the electorate's still white. And if you slice and dice the American electorate ethnically and class-wise, the biggest group in American politics is the white working class. They don't call it working class, because to describe yourself as working class is to admit defeat. But they describe themselves as middle class. White, middle class, biggest group. They exceed in numbers across the board, African Americans and Hispanics, LGBTI and Asians combined. So in eschewing them, she eschewed the best chance she had of winning. And so what you saw, and she's encouraged in this by people like Nancy Pelosi, who have really presided over the destruction of the Democratic Party as a viable governing entity. And I won't go into the detail on that, but you know, it's just, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party since this. But you can see it in decisions that they made. They narrowly lost Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Had they won those three, they'd have been elected. And the fact that they were losing in Ohio and understood that, would have thought you would have sent them down with their pollsters to those other three states which resemble Ohio to see if anything was going wrong. Now what they did was spent more money trying to win in Nebraska, the congressional constituency around Omaha, because two states, Nebraska and Maine, split their electoral college vote on a congressional district basis. So they never got Nebraska's vote, but they thought they might get Omaha, the city of Omaha, which they didn't. They spent more money there than they did in Wisconsin and Michigan. Can you believe it? And she didn't go to Wisconsin in the entire campaign. And she was only in Michigan in the last week or two. Certainly the Russians had a lot to do with this. the FBI with this outcome. But the Russians and the FBI would have been completely irrelevant if there'd been a proper democratic campaign amongst the white working class. Bill tried to get her into that, but Bill was sort of sidelined from the campaign, but partly because the know-alls in the campaign decided he was old-fashioned, didn't know, had no comprehension of these things, and partly because in the attack that they wanted to make on Trump, Bill's a bit whiffy. But but he tried to get example at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. There's a big annual lecture. It's a big deal, and great people give those lectures, and some of the great people who give them are politicians. So Clinton had given one, Obama gave one, and Romney and Reagan and so on had all done the lecture. She was invited to give it, and Bill pleaded with her to go and do it, but she said apparently to him and others, the white Catholics are not part of my constituency. That's cool, that's about 20% of the country. Well, so there's this series of things which she will now profoundly regret that she didn't listen to her husband on in the campaign structure that she put in place. But you can see it in there's a sort of a liberal ethnic objection to the ways in which arguments have developed emanating from white working class America. And politicians like Nancy Pelosi and herself, Elizabeth Warren not, by the way, but you can see them go down that sort of tunnel vision, and to the point where she could describe the white working class as deplorable. And some of the views might be deplorable, but that doesn't get you anywhere. And that was and she will have a learning experience, but terribly embittering one. You win by 3 million, for God's sake. The pollsters were right. That's about what they said she'd win by, and she did. Shame about where it was manifest. But so she will be beyond depression, I think. And Mattis. Mattis is terrific. But that's me. I would fancy that quite a few people here would not necessarily share that view, nor after they met him. But he is a real throwback. He is a Knight Templar. No question about it. He is a military monk. He lives for the core and the country, and he is brilliantly intellectual. I gave him a book produced from the Chief of Army. Chief of Army has a historical conference here every year, and on this one they did 1918, where Australian victories in France were sort of quite decisive. The book was interesting because it sort of did a bit of deconstruction of the Australian and New Zealand armed forces. Not all the chapters were terribly favourable, but there's one interesting chapter, which is what I wanted to mock Mattis with, or to get under his skin. And it was a chapter on the final breakthrough of the Hindenburg Line by Monash's Corps. Well, Monash's Corps had two non-Australian divisions in it. One was American and the other was British. And Monash didn't trust the leadership of the American division. So he salted it with a large number of Australian officers and NCOs. And true to his expectation, as the attack got underway, the division fell apart. But the Australian officers and NCOs took it over, including a sergeant running a battalion. And there was a really effective regathering and crushing of the Germans. So I thought that it was something useful for Mattis to read. And he would, I can't remember, 1918 I think it's called, but he said, well look, I'm going to come around for lunch and I'll give you a book that we can talk about too. He loved the book. And he read it actually all within 24 hours, not just the relevant chapter, the whole book. And he went into, he came around with a book, and I thought this is going to be the answer to it. This is going to be why the Marine Corps is superior to the Army and all this sort of stuff. He said, no, it was a book on Hamilton, the latest biography of Hamilton. He said, you've got to read this. This is the best thing written on post-revolutionary politics in the United States. So you really want to understand how we emanated from all of that, you've got to read this book. And that was not Mad Dog. What's his name? Who's Tinley, Peter Tinley, who was in command of the Australian SAS unit. He's a member of Parliament here now, but he was in command of the SAS unit, Australian SAS unit operating in Afghanistan. And the 10th Mountain Division had been withdrawn and a Marine Division had been inserted, commanded then by Brigadier Mattis. Anyway, they came in because they were operating alongside it. And so Tinley stands up to brief him on the Australian SAS. As he gets out about 2 minutes, then Mattis takes it over. Gives the SAS folks there the history of the Australian SAS, the conflicts that they'd been engaged in, the outcomes of it, the specialities that it had, the competencies that it had. And then he said, you know, if I'm going to attack the gates of hell, I'd want an Australian division alongside me. And so he has he's a real affection for the allies of the United States. He's brilliant, and he doesn't suffer fools, and he doesn't ever take a backward step. So if he has a view on the direction of American security policy, you can be certain that he will express it to the President, and you can be certain that the President will agree with him by the time he leaves the meeting. I guess I'm just back there.
Well, there's actually, we should wind up, but we should take one more. Okay. We've got a few questions, but look, Kim, in the interest of letting you, I wonder if, look, my observation is, having seen everyone, our group asked great questions, but they've just been hanging on every word. It's just fantastic to watch from up here, so we really thank you for a tremendous presentation tonight. I wonder if I could ask our Vice President, Amy, to give a vote of thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Well, I think everybody will agree that that was an amazing way to finish our 70th anniversary year. For those of you that weren't there, we had Kim join us back in May, and he did a keynote speech for us for our 70th anniversary over at the University of Western Australia. And at the time he did predict some difficulties for Hillary, which was very interesting insights to get, and it's fantastic to just have that post-election analysis tonight. Kim, you said that there's volatile times ahead, and it's most important for us to have a deep understanding of what's going on, and you really did that for us tonight. I'm sure most of us here have a lot more gaps than you, so you really filled those in, touching on us and the United States, what it means for our neighbours and their relationship with the States, and then where we fit in between that. So thank you very much, Kim. You said that Obama has been a great president for the region here, and you certainly are a great president for the Institute. And we're really proud to have you here in WA, and we hope that you'll join us again. So thank you very much.
Well, look, I'd just like to finish off, if I may. When I was looking at Kim's biography on Wikipedia, I did notice one thing, that Kim was born on December the 14th, which is tomorrow. So happy birthday, Kim.
Thank you.
It's very kind of you to come out and talk to us on the night before your birthday. I'd like to thank you all for being members of the Institute, for coming along tonight. On your behalf, I'd like to thank all of the committee members and our helpers who helped put these events together and have put so many good events together over the last year. And there are some committee members past and present here. There's a former secretary here. I particularly like to single out Michael Kyle, who's here tonight, who's a long-standing committee member who resigned this year and is sorely missed, but was replaced by I wouldn't talk about the expert elderly, but we've got a good committee. So I'd like to thank all the committee members who are here tonight, and Williams for helping with wine during the year, and people like Sam who help collect money at the front and all that sort of thing. And I won't mention the lemon chicken at the Chinese restaurant down the road, where we normally have it, but they're pretty good too. I'd particularly like to thank Suzanne for putting a Christmas party together tonight. And Suzanne, if you'd like to stand, but before we have the Christmas party, I'd just like to thank you. And if Ash is somewhere, is Ash around anywhere? Ash has got a small token of our appreciation for you. So thanks, Ash. And Ash's secretary, and I'm sure he won't mind me sharing this with you, but I did ask last night whether he got the message well, he asked me whether I'd received the message about the flowers. And I said no, and he looked a bit stunned, and he'd sent a text message which was meant to be to me, but it actually went to Suzanne, and it was Suzanne is happy, does she like natives? And she pretended she hadn't received it. I'm sure you like it. Anyway, this is our Christmas party, and it is a chance to celebrate another year and to reflect on Christmas, and also to make an effort to meet each other. I think that's part of the spirit of Christmas as well. I'd probably like to just reflect on Christmas just to finish off, because I think we've had a great year here at the Institute. We've had some terrific speeches, had a terrific keynote address from Kim, but we've also had fabulous presentations on Brazil, all sorts of issues right around the world. So if you look at what we've talked about, or you've read Australian Outlook, or if you get the Australian Journal of International Affairs, or if you visited the National Conference, where no wonder we're the think tank of the year for the Asia Pacific region for the second year running. But just in terms of the end of the year and the Christmas tree flashing over there, Professor Samina Yasmin, who's away in Pakistan at the moment, but she's one of our vice presidents, and as you know, she runs the Centre for Muslim States and Societies. And she had a weekend event, and she was kind enough to invite me along, and I watched people stumbling over how to thank Samina for a nice event at this time of year, and they were saying, oh, happy festive season, or happy whatever, and Samina would just quite happily turn around and say Merry Christmas. And that's what I say to all of you, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and here's to a healthy, happy and prosperous New Year, next year. And there's an Ian Drury and the Blockheads song called Reasons to be Cheerful, and if we can take anything away from what Kim had to say, I think the Defence Secretary at least is a reason to be cheerful. But as the Honorary Consul for Colombia here in Perth, I can say that the peace agreement in Colombia is something that we should all treasure and take home. So, with that note, there are a few reasons to be cheerful. I wish you a Merry Christmas, and let's enjoy the feast outside. Thank you.